Okay, so this is going to be an extremely uh, sensitive subject. So, trigger warning for those that need it. By the title, you'll already kind of know what we're getting into, but there's going to be a lot of depth that I want to touch on too. Because I think that, okay, so I'm a recovering sex addict. I have found in my experience that this is an affliction that is far more common than 99% of people talk about. In fact, nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about it. I didn't know that it was an issue that I even had. I knew it was an issue that I had, but I didn't know what to call it, or I didn't realize that it was an actual addiction until somebody else had pointed it out to me that way. And um, I talked about that in a different video. A boss had pointed it out to me. And it's less common for women, but I don't think that I'm so, special that it's solely something that I've experienced. I'm sure that there's plenty of other women out there. I met one in the 12-step program, but I know that there's plenty of other women that struggle with it. Um, Maybe not exactly in the same veins, but also, yeah, in the same vein. And what I found is that in my own experience of it, it's also it's the same vein that anybody that deals with it goes through. Um, when I was in the 12-step program, I had multiple men tell me that they were very thankful for my presence in the meeting, just that at first it made them extremely uncomfortable, but that the more that I opened up about my issues, the more that they realized that it's not just men that deal with it. And I think that it's important for me to talk about it as a woman because of that. Because I think so many men struggle with it and view it as a male issue, um, and keep it covert because of that. It's something that they share amongst themselves, and most men make light of it and make excuses for it and even like actively support it as being very manly when generally, I mean, it's an affliction. It's something that those that have it are being victimized by it as much as they could victimize anybody else with it. Sorry if this is shaking. My knees are shaking. My voice is shaking because I'm very emotional. As I started thinking about it and realizing the depths that it goes into and just how important it is to talk about these things. Sorry, I'm not trying to shake the camera so much. So, okay, so I put it in the other video, and I'll put it here, that I was not self-aware. I knew that I had an issue, but I made light of it. I found ways to normalize it, and as a woman, it was very easy for me to normalize it, because most men that I interacted with or that I found treated it like it was an a desirable trait for a woman to have. Um, Particularly because it's received as having a high sex drive. And so many people nowadays identify themselves by their sexuality in such a way that, you know, if they have a high sex drive, somebody else having somebody that they would be interested in having a high sex drive is like, great, right? The issue, obviously, with all of that is that that's such a shallow point of identification of self. Sex is a sacred act, not a um, tool for pleasure, as much as we tend to use it that way. And anyone whether they would consider themselves a sex addict or not, that uses sex casually is being victimized by that. Whether they're aware of it or not, in the same way that in the same way that I wasn't aware of it, but I was, you'll hear people, you know, constantly complaining that, or struggling that all of their relationship issues revolve around not um, receiving the gratification that they're after, not being able to maintain deep personal relationships, not being able to engage in emotional vulnerability, and that the casual sexual relationships that they engage in end up being somehow destructive, whether it be emotionally or physically or whatever. Um, there's so many people, men and women, that live a lifestyle of consistent casual sexuality, and um, it it claims a part of them that they can't seem to regain access to otherwise. So it just creates this cycle of using it that way, using sex that way, and their own sexuality that way, in order to gain a sense of self that they've lost. And they just keep trying to find it in that same space, and that's just not helpful. It's not healthy. It's not how it works, how self-actualization works. And it just seems to be um, a pretty common issue. Especially like the people that identify themselves by that, like, oh, this is what makes me feel powerful. This is what makes me feel valuable. This is what makes me feel like I'm worth something to society when I can offer my sex casually. I'm like a perfect example of what that looks like. Part of, I believe, my entire healing process, and part of being able like to go through that and to be able to come where I am now, is to be that example, almost in that way, for people, because I've been known to everyone as an extremely casually sexual person. It's been very much a part of my identity for my entire life. And to go through the healing that I've gone through, I mean, it's been years. It's been years. It's been over a decade now, that I even started trying to heal. And even up until just a few months ago, it was still something I was carrying as part of my identity. Um, I would go through breaks, like more recently, maybe within the last 6 years, since I broke up with my ex. I've been going through the process of, and even through him, I learned that a lot, but like, I've gone through bouts where I've been completely celibate, and in those times, I found myself very hard pressed for any sort of sexual attention, and hard pressed, like not looking for it. Like, I've been very frustrated by receiving that attention, and that wasn't fair, really, to anyone, just for the fact that I was it was that was my fault. It was me that had done that to myself and made myself accessible that way. And it took a really long time for me to even understand that. Um, which again, like, all of this has been shown to me through other people's engagements with me, more than just coming of it of myself. And that's a big point of self-actualization that I'm learning now, but that like is so true, and that I want to share with people too, is that like, it's never like, to know yourself is truly to be able to look out and find yourself outside of yourself, and then to know the world outside of yourself is to be able to find it within you. You won't be able to come to a true self-actualization without being truly aware of not just your surroundings, but your effect on them and the effect that they have on you. And that's just what seems to be so amiss in most people's lives and identities, and why we tend to cling to these things for a sense of identity. It gets extremely deep when it comes to the individual and how they choose to process these things or respond to these things, because everybody's different. And in finding ourselves, like I have trans friends who it took it took stepping into that shadow of sexuality and sexual identity in order to truly find themselves. But I also have um, ex trans or like people that were questioning that have found themselves not to be, that went through that same process only to find that they didn't identify with those things. And I've had, I've known any type of sex addict you could imagine, whether it be somebody that's their sex addiction, it actually comes from, let's say, like meth addicts. They tend to also pick up a sex addiction right along with the meth. Heroin addicts often do as well, and alcoholics, because and coke addicts, um, because those drugs enhance the sexual experience in a very shallow way. And when their identities are based on that shallow sexuality, or the shallow aspect of their sexuality, it just goes hand in hand. And most people don't realize that sex addiction is even a real thing, I think. Like I said at the beginning, like I think a lot of people view it as like, oh, I just have a high sex drive. And most people don't realize how sacred sex is. Um, the trans friends that I have that have found themselves through their sexuality are, to me, some of the most honorable people I tend to know, only based on that concept. Many of them at least tend to hold sex as more sacred than, let's say, the um, chronically single friends that I have that use sex socially. And that's why, like, you can't just put people into a box based on these things, um, because it's different for everyone. And that's the importance of self-actualization. Sorry, that's the importance of self-actualization, is because it allows the person to define themselves outside of that box, that we would tend to put people in. The same thing goes for um, pedophiles. And when I say that word, like, it has such a harsh meaning because it also tends to equate to being a child predator. But that's not always the case, especially not nowadays, where the way our media works and the just absolute accessibility of pornography online, um, and the way that especially like this society in America works, like it's very, um, there's a lot of, how do I put that? There's just a lot of different avenues someone can take to end up in basically the same place, but it really is the intention that decides if the person is an active predator or not, or even potentially a predator. And those things get extremely convoluted. And like in the same way that, like, as I was going through the 12-step program, believe it's the third step is to take an inventory of yourself. and your habits and your issues, and to determine what is in a green space, what is in a yellow space, and what is in a red space. Green space being safe, yellow space being a warning, potential threat, might be leading out to the red, and the red being what you do not, or into the red, and the red being what you don't engage in. um, and deciding for yourself, being able to decide for yourself what those things are. So when it came to my sex addiction, like I found that, well, my biggest issue wasn't even having sex with people. That was an underlying issue, not choosing healthy partners, being willing to engage in risky sexual behaviors, um, being like preoccupied with sexual endeavors. That was all like that all came after the porn addiction. I was addicted to online porn by the time I was 12. Um, I then just went out the older that I got, and I didn't start having sex until I was 17. So there had been years that I'd been actively engaged in sexual behaviors, especially online, before I had actively engaged in it, like physically in any sort of intercourse. Um, and that warped me in a lot of different ways as well. But in the same regard, so what I found, like for me, like for instance, a red for me would be um, non-consensual sex, which is easy enough to find online. When it comes to porn, like there's rape fantasies that you can find it on Pornhub, like the easiest porn site to get to, basically, and like, you know, um, it's not hard to search for those things and find those things for a child to, let alone an adult to. Where consensual non-consent is something I'm actively willing to engage in, given the right circumstances and the right partner. I haven't been able to engage in that in a healthy fashion ever. I do believe, though, that it can exist. So I would put that in the yellow. And it would be in the green if I had a healthy, stable, trusting relationship with a long-term commitment where I could trust those things. Um, that's for me. What that looked like in my porn addiction was that, well, it evolved over time. What I found is that I can't even engage, and I don't even watch porn anymore. But when I have watched porn, I learned that I couldn't watch heterosexual porn, because it was only a matter of time before I would start trying to find consensual non-consent, and that would very quickly turn into non-consensual. And I would seek those things out. This is a point of a lot of guilt that I carry. So it's not easy to talk about, but I think it's very important too, because I know I'm not alone. Um, the issue in that was that, like, it's one thing when you know for a fact that the two people are engaging in something that they have deemed between themselves as healthy. It's something entirely different when one of the people involved isn't actively consenting. And when you're actively searching for less and less consenting uh, sexual behavior, you're actively supporting assault, period. It was something, I mean, it's what drove me to start the 12-step program in the first place, because my porn addiction had gotten so out of control, because I had gotten to the point where that was all the porn that I was watching. And even that started to become more and more perverse, where it couldn't, okay, this is going to be extremely sensitive. Something, as simple as like a dude jerking off on a bus would eventually turn into somebody would turn into like people engaging in sexual behaviors with people while they were asleep, that would turn into people drugging people in order to engage with them sexually, and that would turn into incestuous engagements sexually in that realm, and then that would turn into um, incestuous child abuse. Essentially, I didn't look up child porn. That was never something I wanted to ever be actively engaged in, but I would try to find um, younger girls with older men and being just completely taken advantage of by the older men. When I started going to, even before I started going to the 12-step program, I recognized that as a serious issue. And I felt so much guilt about it. And I didn't know why that was what I wanted to be looking at, why that was what I wanted to be engaging myself in, and why it was stimulating to me at all. I didn't understand. And I started to process those things back when I was like 17 or 18. I started the 12-step program when I was 19, right before I turned 20 or right after I turned 20. Um, but what I had found even prior to the 12-step program was that the reason that, or where that was coming from, the core of where those things were coming from, uh, was me trying to gain some sense of control over my trauma, and putting myself in the position of the predator made me feel that sense of power. But that's when I went to the 12-step program, because I was like, and then I just, the more I thought about it, the more I was like, that's not the type of power I want to feel. I don't, it's in the same sense. I mean, it's no different than somebody becoming abusive, you know, because they were abused, or somebody, you know, treating somebody else poorly because they were treated poorly. I don't agree with any of it. I don't think that's um, it, trying to gain the same power that's been used against you isn't the right course of action. It isn't going to change anything. It just puts you now in that bad space. You know, it makes you now you're the predator. And that's the worst thing about online porn, is because you can so easily become a predator in a safe space when you're all alone and nobody else is around, and it doesn't feel like you're actively preying on somebody. But every time you search those things, every time you look specifically through all of those videos to find those things, you're preying on someone. You're looking for a victim. You're even, and like, even in my mind, like, it didn't matter who the victim was as much as it mattered like the dynamics of what was happening. But that didn't make it better or okay by any means ever. And you know, I'm just as guilty as anyone else who's gone to those places and done those things in that way, because it was in my heart to engage that way with those things and to find some sense of self-stimulation off of those things. It's wrong. It's fucked up. It's extremely sick. It's not healthy. It's sick, and it it displays the sickness of the depth of the sickness of the psychology of the individual engaging in it, you know. So when I did my inventory, like I found those things in of myself, and I've had to go through a really arduous process of healing through those things because of the engagements that I've had with it. I was victimized a lot, but I also victimized myself a lot, and have had to take responsibility for those things. And that is, I mean, you know, it's easy to call out an abuser or a predator or somebody who's in the obvious wrong, um, when you've been victimized by those things. It's a lot harder as the person actively doing the victimizing, even to yourself, to acknowledge that and be willing to change those things. Especially in a society that's so quick to call every person a monster for things that they do that are not in any way acceptable. It is monstrous, but people are people. They are not monsters, even when they try their hardest to be. And trust me that I have known so many people that do their damnedest to be as monstrous as possible because they get off on it, because being viewed as evil makes them feel powerful. They're still not monsters. Why would you give them that power? Especially somebody that's trying to be viewed that way. Like, no, you're a coward and you're pathetic. And I was a coward and I was pathetic. And, um, it's just the way that it is. I have known um, a lot of pedophiles. I've known a lot of pedophiles. Growing up, I knew a lot because I was being uh, preyed on by them. But I also, then in my teen years, started seeking them out, um, again, to gain a sense of control over those things. And that's what's so wicked specifically about pedophilia, is because like it is extremely natural for a child, um, which 15, 16, 17, even 18, 19, 20, 21, I was still a child, to be honest, but like especially 16, 17, 18, 15, 14, 13, when I first started actively trying to engage with adults sexually, in any regard, um, I was victimizing them. I was victimizing myself. I was a predator to adults as a child, but I was a child. And the responsibility of an adult is to be able to recognize who is a child, so that regardless of what that child has been through, and regardless of how they're expressing that, and regardless of what type of control they're trying to gain over their own reality, it's the responsibility of the adult to recognize that and to be aware that, like, as a child, that's natural to want to do. Um, as unnatural as I was going about it, it was still coming from a natural place for me as a child to want to be received as an adult, or as mature, or as capable, especially when I had been traumatized the ways that I had, because it was in being traumatized that I'd been made to feel weak and helpless. And so those were the ways that I was trying to gain my power back. Um, the adults that actively engaged in that were still predators, whether they had sought me out or not, um, because they weren't um, taking responsibility for their own maturity to not exploit those things, even if I was extremely willing to exploit myself. And it is an issue that is increasingly more common with our social media and whatnot, and just our access to media in general, because like other cultures don't work the same ways that we do. And in another culture where a 12 or 13-year-old girl is viewed as a woman, well, if she's being raised in that culture, then she's being raised as a woman, so that by the point that she is 12 or 13, she is more like she's more mature, she's more accountable for herself at that point. I just still don't think that it's okay, because I think that there's a very physical, that's why I say even up until 21, there's still a very physical point of growth and development that is yet to even begin at that point. And there's still something extremely fucked up about like a 17-year-old trying to be with a 12-year-old, or a 25-year-old trying to be with a 16-year-old, or a 30-year-old trying to be with, even at 30 and 20, you have, at 30 and 18 though, 30 and 18 is still predatory. By 20, you've developed enough to be able to start making your own mistakes and to learn from them in a way that you just don't at younger than that. And like, it's such a fucked up thing too, because like even in that, like, somebody who started doing heroin when they were 12 or 13 or 14, like it affects them in such a way that like they tend to live their lives in such a way that like by the time they're 18, they generally have experienced more or have matured more in different ways or like aged in different ways more than like your average 18-year-old. But, you know, that doesn't make it okay. It still says something about somebody that's in their 20s to be with a teenager. Like, it doesn't matter how mature that teenager is, that 20 something year old is still immature. And that's a problem. It's a problem because